As an Alexander Technique teacher and a movement mechanics specialist, what do I think about body shaping garments? This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're looking at a very interesting history of particularly women's garments. Now, this of course is going to have a very kind of culturally narrowed history look because we're looking at specifically the cultures that had corsetry throughout their histories. And that's specifically going to be especially Western Europe, and then once Western Europe colonized a lot of North America, what happened there. So I'm not able to give a really great historical background on how other cultures have changed over time and the way that they approached body shape and its associations with movement. But in the culture that I'm in, it's a really interesting topic to dig into, especially with current media trends, looking at, shows like Bridgerton and other historical dramas where they are addressing this idea of what was fashion like at the time and what were women's undergarments like at the time. So, as you can see, I've got on an interesting garment. It's a little debatable whether this is a corset. I think I would call it a corset. This is considered a midriff corset because it goes only up to my underbust. So it runs to about here. And on me, just with the way that my garments fit, you can actually see the cups and the wires of my bra, because I wear underwire bras, is actually fitting over it just a little bit because I can't really get it to not do that. So this is a garment that I've worn maybe twice in the last 6 or 7 years that I've had it. This is not a regular part of my wardrobe, but it's an interesting thing to play around with. And I find that for the times that I have students who are frequently going to be like women opera singers who need to wear restrictive costumes on stage, or for students who do drag performances where they're wearing restrictive costumes on stage, they get a little surprised when I tell them, if your corset fits correctly, it's probably fine. The issue is when they don't fit correctly. So that's why we need to dive into the history a little bit. I am not a historical fashion researcher, but it is one of my niche subject interests. I will put a couple links down in the description to people who are actual historical fashion researchers. These are people with 10 to 20 plus year experiences in this. They're creating videos and research documents and books, published books about all of this stuff. And they also happen to run YouTube channels because that's one of the main ways nowadays that researchers can get enough funding to actually dig into what they want to look at if they're not able to get academic and university or grant writing type funding. So they do things like make educational content on YouTube. So there is a pretty big following on YouTube of historical fashion people in particular. I follow several of them. My top 3 are Bernadette Banner. I also have her book, Make, Sew, and Mend. Nicole Rudolph is wonderful. And then Abby Cox is another great one to be aware of. These are all, researchers who have pretty hefty academic backgrounds, and they also do a lot of reproduction garments using the original patterns from that time. So one of the main things we need to keep in mind when it comes to the history of corsets and bodies is that before mass production, all clothing was custom made. Period. I would like you to imagine, what do you think it costs nowadays to get a custom-made, hand-sewn corset? Just ballpark. Well, it's a minimum of $500, probably more in most cases. The $500 ones are really, really simple, have no additional decorative stitching or anything on them, the most basic ones. You're looking at around $500 because that's the amount of hours that it takes in order to create something that is quite complicated. People's bodies are unique. One of the reasons that I don't wear this very often at all, even when I'm wearing something like, a fairly sleek dress, where I like the shape and the silhouette that this gives me, is this isn't custom made. I bought this at a big box store because I don't have $500 to spend on a corset. Nope. So The main issue that a lot of folks run into is a misconception about how corsetry and restrictive or shaping garments were used. And it intersects really well with one of the main habits that people come in here to Alexander Technique lessons already doing. You can't engage with that habit in one of these. We'll get into that in a little bit. So, historically, all corsets were custom made, period. You wouldn't have that many of them because they're very expensive. But consider, you didn't have expenses like a car or a phone or a computer, right? All of these other things that are technological expenses that we are expected to have today, pretty much by necessity, at least in the US. You don't have that then. So what are the ways that people used their money and used their connections with other people, learned to do themselves in some very rare cases, but for the most part, they would have to buy these things. Well, I've only got one phone, one pair of glasses, I have one car, it's quite old and was not new when I bought it, so I'm certainly on the lower end of like personal luxuries and expenditures in that way. People didn't have that many corsets, and they were expected to last for decades. Really, really long time. One of the reasons that they would last so long is something that is another common misconception today. Corsets were never worn next to the skin. They were worn more like how I'm wearing it. This would be like a chemise, or one way that we would kind of think of it today is like a slip. You wear something underneath it. That garment, that basic foundational garment that's worn next to the skin, you would have a bunch of those, and you flip those out regularly, generally daily. It's your underwear. In the same way that we think of underwear today, you trade that out daily. They considered it whole body underwear, so a chemise would go, it's like a dress, like a kind of a nightgown, kind of a look to it today. That chemise, that undergarment, absorbs oils from the skin. It also prevents any kind of rough edges on any stitching from irritating your skin, and it just really helps all around. So anytime you see in any historical dramas that they're wearing a corset next to the skin, just chuck that idea out the window. That's not true. That's not how this worked. Nobody would have done that. It'll ruin your corset really quickly. Another thing that people often also misconstrue is the effect of these little things. You see how there are these channels that run up and down? This is the stiff part. So this particular garment is utilizing modern stretch fabrics. So the fabric itself does stretch in this case, and we'll look at another compression-based garment in a little bit to compare that doesn't have any boning in it. This is called boning. The name comes from whalebone, which was not physical bone, it was baleen. So baleen in baleen whales was the filter structures where a big, think of like a humpback whale or something, when it eats a whole bunch of krill, then the baleen close around it and they expel the water with a filter in place that keeps the krill in, and then they swallow it and eat it. It's made of keratin, the same things as our fingernails. So that's actually the stiffness of historical whalebone. Nowadays we use plastic for that. You can get what's considered, modern synthetic whalebone that is designed to be like the exact same texture and flexibility as historical whale baleen was. But a lot of cosplayers, when they're doing this stuff on a budget, they just use zip ties. So you just cut a zip tie to length, plastic zip tie, file the edges so that it's not sharp and won't dig through, and then put that in between two channels of stitching. That's called a boning channel. So you can imagine how much work it takes to put those in all around a garment. All of these different panels, they all need to be sized correctly. You have to consider the way that each individual person curves. You have to consider the length and the distance between different areas of their bodies, what they need to be able to do in this corset, the kind of materials, the kind of look, right? There's a lot of expertise that goes into this. What's fascinating is there is a lot of evidence that points to the modern anti-corset kind of vibe that a lot of people have was formed in a smear campaign by Victorian-era men who were upset that a lot of women at the time were able to have successful businesses as corset makers. We have primary source evidence that Victorian era, so this is mid to late 1800s, men in that time started out of nowhere publishing newspaper articles, which we still have these articles, we can look at them, that said women just don't know what they're doing. Women are doing things that are unhelpful for them, and they are unhealthy, and they're going to cause miscarriages and misplace their organs and various other nonsense. And they specifically targeted these women-owned businesses, which is a fascinating connection that I think more people need to know about. So, how were corsets actually used at the time? There is a fascinating video that I highly recommend everyone should watch. I'll put a link to it down in the description, from Nicole Rudolph. She went through, I think it was 500 years of women's corsetry in Western Europe, specifically England, I think, and measured her own dimensions without any corsetry on, and then in that custom-built corset. The way that she created all of these garments was through actual pattern making books that they had at the time. And so she was using the exact same techniques and same materials. This is a historical reproduction garment rather than a modern interpretation of those garments. Bernadette Banner has also done a lot of really similar things where she measures before and after her own dimensions versus wearing the corset as it's actually designed to be worn. The fascinating thing is, at most, these corsets only drew in the waist by roughly 2 inches. It's barely any, not much at all. What they did instead is they actually tended to pad out the hips, and then for an over-bust corset, so not a midriff corset like I've got, one that actually comes over the bust, that also would be padded out. It's drag. That's exactly what drag artists do today. It's about illusion. So when you're seeing old drawings and even some of the very earliest photographs, when you're seeing these women who seem to have ridiculous proportions, the vast majority of the time what you're actually seeing is a woman who is extremely thin and has padded out her bust and her hips. They didn't actually have these crazy hourglass figures. That was understood to be something that you achieve through supportive garments. That has shifted. Today, what we have is a culture that says your body must create the ideal silhouette for our preferences today. It's your body that needs to conform, rather than you wear garments that can adjust and create illusion. That's rough, and it leads to a whole bunch of problems. So now we need to get into, when I say that this has issues because it's not custom made, what specifically is the problem? In this case, the problem is this is built for someone with a longer torso than me. So let's go back to our basic Alexander technique, movement mechanics for how do we bend. We bend, rather than the spine, which is just a flexible pool noodle, we bend at the hip joints, knees, and ankles. Where are my hip joints? On me, right about that high. That is below the corset. When I bend, that bending happens below my corset. And because the boning is flexible, yes, I can still breathe. No, they weren't using still boning. Every once in a while, for certain types of, especially stays, which would have been pre-1700s, they weren't center closing, and they would have something fairly stiff called a busk in the front, where it would be possibly wood or steel, but very, very thin, and it was only right in the front. It was not on the sides. You can absolutely still flex in this. This does not prevent me from being able to move. What it actually does is it works a whole lot like a weightlifting belt. Are you about to go tell Olympic level athletes that they're wearing harmful corsets? I hope not. They're not. It is a piece of gear for a specific purpose. So in the same way that a weightlifting belt, which forms constriction right around the waist, it's there for a reason. This is also here for a reason. Different reason, for sure, but it's there for a reason, and it actually does something really similar. So with an over-bust corset, it's a combination weightlifting belt and sports bra. Sports bras work through compression. There is no like wire underneath it, it just holds you in. And for a lot of people, I'm also in this category with how I'm shaped, if I do something like go for a run without one, it hurts. It's too much bouncing, it hurts. I don't want to do that. It's not for other people, it's for me. Same with like going quickly down a flight of stairs in your pajamas, you better hold yourself in because that hurts. So these supportive garments are restrictive to create support. That's how the support works. It does not make any more sense to tell people that their corsetry is bad for them than it would be to say that to someone who is wearing a weightlifting belt and a sports bra. It wasn't just high-class nobility Bridgerton women who wore corsets. Farm women wore corsets. Milkmaids, seamstresses, right? All these women wore these things as supportive garments. They likely weren't tight lacing. Tight lacing is when you pull a corset very, very tight. It was not very common at all. And really, tight lacing can only be done on someone who has a fairly long torso and probably a bit of cushioning to themselves, which again, for at the time, working class women likely did not have the nutrition available to have some squish to them. They were pretty thin, pretty lean for the most part. So they wouldn't tight lace because there's nowhere to go. That would be actually trying to fully compress your rib cage. So if I were to really allow my leg to go up into a 90-degree angle, watch this piece of boning right here. I'll get my arm out of the way so you can see it. See how it gets in the way? And it has to buckle? It's too long for me. This corset is not custom made. So if I need to be able to sit, the restrictive aspect of this is not at my waist because I don't need to bend at my waist in order to sit. That's not where my legs are. The restrictive part is at the very bottom with my legs. So if I flip this up a little bit, and again, this works specifically because boning is flexible, and yeah, you can flip it. It's fine, very comfortable, and in fact is quite supportive and feels kind of nice. It's like a hug. In the same way that like if you wear like compression socks or something, it's kind of a hug on all sides. That's about what it feels like. So if I were going to wear shapewear garments, as we tend to call them today, I probably wouldn't use this style of one. I got this because it was on sale and I was curious about wearing one myself, specifically for if I was going to like a partner's dance or something where I want like a really sleek silhouette. But then I never really ended up wearing it and pretty much stopped dancing at this point anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So what about this interesting thing? This is relevant because of a word that most of you are probably aware of, Spanx. Spanx is a brand of shapewear. I don't know if this is actually Spanx brand, the one that I am wearing. I think this one is, but I cut the tags off of things, so I don't know what it actually is. Sorry. Spanx is a brand. It's very commonly available in tons of different lingerie departments, from like high-end stuff to huge big box stores. Like Spanx is everywhere. And you will hear people say things like, for my wedding, I wore 2 pairs of Spanx. That's extremely restrictive. And it's not considered unhealthy in the same way that we have this idea of like, corsets are bad for women. Okay, but you're wearing Spanx. So there are lots of different styles of compression garments and supportive garments that use, instead of boning, which if you're not using boning, you need to use modern, typically synthetic substitutes for support or compression. You get something like this. So this interesting thing here is shorts plus midriff. So this comes up to about the same height as the corset I'm wearing now, under bust area. It stretches a whole lot, and it also has silicone grippy bits. Aha! Assets by Spanx. That's the brand. This is Spanx. It's got a silicone strip at the top so it's grippy. I find that that is not sufficient and the whole thing actually rolls down. move at all, so I don't think I've ever actually gotten a chance to wear this. I, again, got it because there was a sale at the lingerie department and I was curious. So this is a combination shorts, hips, and waist smoother. So this is more what you're likely to see today. This is really strong fabric. It is hard to get that to stretch. That's the whole point, is because it kind of shapes you and holds you in. Again, for someone who does not have much squish to their bodies in their adipose tissue, which is the scientific term for fat tissue, I like adipose tissue because it's a little bit less emotionally weighted. For someone who just doesn't have much of a layer of adipose tissue on their bodies, they're not going to see a whole bunch of difference wearing something that is shaping. This idea that, historical women were, being subjugated from everything from the men that they had to deal with to the clothes that they were choosing to wear because it was bad for them, is just really not true. I find that this is perfectly fine, because once you learn how to bend in ways that actually work with how the skeleton works, this isn't in the way. Unless it's too long, then it's in the way of the stupid legs, but there's no issue at the waist. I can also breathe perfectly fine, not just in my rib cage, but also in my belly. Remember that from previous discussions on how breath mechanics work. When your diaphragm goes down on your inhales, your organs need to have somewhere to go. That's why your belly goes out when you breathe in. I'm not struggling to get a full breath in this at all. I'm not struggling to speak full sentences. I'm fully confident that I would be able to sing wearing this. Haven't had a reason to, but I'm absolutely certain that I could, because now I've been talking for at least 10 minutes more, and it's not a problem at all. So, what I would encourage everyone to consider is that when you see folks, particularly like actresses, complaining about when this director put me in this corset, it was awful and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Was it custom made? Were they attempting to tight-lace someone who shouldn't be tight-lacing anyway, because most Hollywood actresses are very thin people in the first place, and there's no squish there to take in on the sides? And are they making them wear it against their skin? All of that, yeah, absolutely. They should not be doing that to actresses. It's not healthy, it's not fair, and it puts them in really terrible positions where they have to choose between their health or their performance. That shouldn't be something they have to choose with. But that's not from the existence of corsets. It's not from the existence of shapewear garments. And it's just historically not accurate in the first place for when they're making like historical dramas. So, how does this all interact with my commitment to body neutrality? Actually fine, I think, because the whole idea here is you don't need to have to change your actual body shape. You don't need to eliminate any squish or, extra padding that we've got if you're trying to get a good silhouette. We can actually learn a whole bunch from historical fashion and today drag performers who do things like wear a corset and then pad out bust and hips if you want an hourglass figure. If you just want a smoother silhouette, then we have a whole bunch of options, like the shorts to midriff compression Spanx there, that honestly, yeah, I think it's fine. If you're going to wear something that has more stiff components to it, like boning, it's got to be custom made. Or you just have to get really lucky that your proportions need to be exactly the same as what that garment is designed for. So I hope this was an interesting dive into one of my niche interests. I encourage you all to get curious about what does your clothing do and how does that impact the way that you organize yourself.